Around 9,000 years ago, societies across the Near East were changing in profound ways. From the Levant to the Zagros Mountains, and from the Euphrates to the plains of Anatolia, hunter-gatherers were settling and building permanent homes and experimenting with agriculture. This was the age of the first villages and the earliest farmers. It was an era before cities and kings, before writing and temples, when new ways of living together were being tested for the very first time. And on the broad Konya plain of central Anatolia, one community took these experiments further than anywhere else we know of. This is one of the most important and most fascinating sites in prehistory, and I think it's also one of the most unusual. Here, hundreds or perhaps even thousands of people gathered, not in streets and plazas, but in tightly packed houses. They buried their dead beneath their floors, painted their walls with animals and symbols, and rebuilt some of their homes again and again over the same ground. And they made astonishing figurines from stone and clay. For over 1,000 years, it was one of the largest and most enduring settlements on Earth, yet it seems to have had no great rulers and no monuments of power. Its people left behind only the traces of daily life, preserved layer by layer beneath the clay. Some researchers claim that, unlike the modern world, this was a socially egalitarian society with gender equality, or even that it was a matriarchy, a society ruled by women. In some ways, it seems like a place of contradictions. A farming society whose iconography was focused on hunting. Their frescoes display virile men chasing down wild oryx, and yet their figurines depict mature, fleshy, immobile women. So was this actually a society ruled by women, and was it really as egalitarian as is claimed, or were some people more equal than others? And what can the latest ancient DNA studies reveal about these pioneering people and the nature of their society? What I'm really interested in is how and why this settlement changed over time, in how these people responded to climatic, environmental and social challenges, and in what ultimately happened to them. This is the story of the rise and fall of one of humanity's earliest and most extraordinary settlements, Çatalhöyük. This video is sponsored by Odoo. Odoo is an all-in-one management software that provides you with a range of applications to simplify the day-to-day management of your business, whatever its size, including invoicing, accounting, project management and much more. And Odoo's website application is a powerful app for efficiently creating a website quickly, easily and for free. Creating your website is fast and easy. The built-in website configurator guides you through the process in just 4 simple steps. You define the type of site you want, choose a color palette, add the pages and features you want, and select a theme from a wide range of available designs. Then the structure of your website is ready, and then you can customize it. The interface is totally intuitive and designed for everyone, even if you're a complete beginner. There's a simple drag and drop system, and you can add blocks anywhere on your site very easily. Every aspect of your site can be customized, from text and colors to images and layout. I made a website on Çatalhöyük for this video in about 15 minutes, which has images, text, buttons and embedded video. And best of all, you can create your website completely for free. Odoo offers a lifetime free app that includes unlimited hosting and support, so you can get started without any upfront cost. You'll also receive a free custom domain for your first year, making it easy to launch a professional online presence right away. So, if you're interested in creating your own website or in any of Odoo's other applications for your business, please use the link in the description below. Thank you to Odoo for sponsoring the video. Around 11,700 years ago, the last glacial period ended. The Holocene epoch brought warmer, wetter, and most importantly perhaps, more stable conditions across much of the Near East. Lakes expanded, grasslands flourished, and wild cereals spread across the Anatolian plateau. For the first time in tens of thousands of years at least, the environment offered a sustained opportunity to settle down, and the domestication of plants and animals began across the region we call the Fertile Crescent. Some hunter-gatherers in the Near East had been living in settlements and even building monumental structures before agriculture was developed or adopted. Most famously perhaps at Göbekli Tepe, which dates to about 9,500 BC to about 8,000 BC and is around 500 kilometers to the east of Çatalhöyük. But during this era, as agriculture was developing, different groups in the region were choosing to live in different ways. some settlements in upland zones, like Göbekli Tepe, built monumental structures with stone and created large public ritual spaces, while lowland settlements, like Çatalhöyük in the Konya Plain, tended to focus more on domestic architecture built in clay without public monumental structures. No doubt some of this was due to the ecological aspects of the surrounding landscape, but these were also conscious decisions taken by people on how they preferred to live. Central Anatolia was on the far west of this arc that we call the Fertile Crescent, but it wasn't a marginal landscape. You can see why it attracted people. The Konya Plain lay between ecological worlds: steppe to the north, mountains to the south, obsidian-rich volcanic landscapes to the east. Seasonal wetlands formed around ancient lakes, creating a mosaic of resources like fish and birds, and land animals like deer, boar and aurochs, and fertile soils. And importantly, the most critical material for these people, clay. And long before Çatalhöyük was settled, people in the region were already experimenting with new ways of life. Studies of ancient DNA show that early agriculturalists from Upper Mesopotamia mixed with Eastern Anatolia hunter-gatherers to create new admixed populations that incorporated different economic and cultural elements in different places. At sites like Çatalhöyük, dating to about 8,300 to 7,800 BC, and Çatalhöyük, dating to about 8,400 to 7,400 BC, communities combined hunting and gathering with early cultivation. These didn't tend to be fully agricultural societies, but they were choosing which elements of these new ideas to incorporate by tending certain plants and corralling certain animals and staying in one place for longer stretches of time. And after these initial mixing events in the region, ancient DNA shows continuity between these earlier Central Anatolian communities and the later inhabitants of Çatalhöyük. There was some gene flow from the Levant and Upper Mesopotamia, but Çatalhöyük emerged largely from local populations. And this is one of the points that interests me the most. You had these various settlements across the region formed from the same basic genetic components, and which were part of the same broad cultural and technological continuum, but the settlements all had unique elements in terms of their design and their cultural practices. All these new technologies and ideas were spreading, but various groups were incorporating them in their own ways. It feels like an era of innovation and experimentation in a state of tension with tradition. Perhaps that's true of all societies everywhere, but this was an era when even the idea of rectangular houses was a relatively recent innovation. People must have spent a lot of time discussing the costs and benefits of mobility versus sedentism and growing crops rather than gathering wild plants and tending herds instead of hunting wild animals. No doubt there were disagreements that couldn't be resolved, and there is evidence that people joined and left the various settlements over time. It seems that people from surrounding groups formed settlements, and that these later broke up and the people dispersed, likely reforming again in different places. And it was around 7,100 BC, as far as we know, that a cluster of households formed on a slight rise beside the Kasamba River. This would grow to become the place we know as Çatalhöyük. The location offered access to water, arable land, and links to more distant resources like obsidian from Cappadocia. The surrounding river and lake deposits also provided the clay they needed to build their homes. And crucially, wild cattle and other animals like red deer roamed the nearby plains. Culturally, it seems similar to the earlier settlement of Çatalhöyük. There are many differences between the sites, but the socio-cultural continuities are strong. It seems like a group from Çatalhöyük founded Çatalhöyük. On the other hand, genetic evidence suggests a closer affinity with the people of Çatalhöyük, so perhaps ideas and people from these different places combined to form the new society at Çatalhöyük. Over generations, this settlement grew, spreading outwards and upwards as houses were dismantled and built anew on top of the ones that came before, and on top of the detritus and waste created by generations of inhabitants. This long process created the East Mound, a densely packed mass of mud brick architecture rising to 20 metres above the surrounding plain. And it was this mound that first piqued the interest of British archaeologist James Mellart in 1958. The excavations that he led here in the 1960s revealed this incredible site for the first time in thousands of years, and the wall paintings and figurines astonished the world. Unfortunately, Melart was embroiled in a series of scandals involving accusations of fabricating finds, creating forgeries, and smuggling treasures out of Turkey. In response, the Turkish authorities kicked him out of the country, and the site of Çatalhöyük was left for decades. Its partially excavated houses suffered from erosion, and fragile artworks were lost to the elements forever. But between 1993 and 2018, the site was excavated under the leadership of Ian Hodder, and this excavation became something of an archaeological icon, recognised globally for its excellence of methods and multidiscipline collaboration. There is an enormous amount of information about this site. Links to some key sources are in the video description. There's so much published, in fact, that it's hard to stop reading about it once you start. Even so, there's still a lot we don't know, because for one thing, only a portion of the site has been excavated. The settlement is extremely dense in every dimension, and excavation is, by its very nature, destructive. Every house and layer that is excavated is also destroyed in the process, although the material is converted into data. Modern archaeologists try to destroy as little as possible through excavations, and all that data has to be recorded and analysed and interpreted, and different experts come to different conclusions. Anyway, the oldest layers of the site are of course at the bottom, and it's not easy to get down all that way, not least because you have to destroy all the layers above it. So we know relatively less about the start of the settlement than its later parts. But archaeologists believe that from the earliest times, the house was the core organisational element for Çatalhöyük. Of course it was where people lived, but it was also the ritual focus for the occupants. The walls were a canvas for expressing ideas and displaying, perhaps, a kind of wealth or status. The houses were even cemeteries for the dead, who were buried beneath the floors. And it wasn't just the physical material either. The house was a social unit. The people who formed the household weren't just close family members either. It was more complicated than that. And the building of the houses and their eventual destruction and rebuilding were also both practical and ritual acts. But to understand the houses, the ritual and symbolic interests expressed within them, and the nature of the settlement as a whole, we have to understand its wider context, the environment around Çatalhöyük, and crucially, how it changed over time. I must just mention the chronology of the site because it's important, critical really, for our understanding of this society. The main Çatalhöyük East Mound was occupied throughout the 7th millennium BC, from about 7,150 to about 5,950 BC. And many cultural practices were consistent across this time, while other customs changed. And in tracking these changes, researchers have defined different phases of the occupation, such as early, middle, late, and final, or sometimes more broadly, early versus late, with the years around 6,500 BC as a time of change. And the world around Çatalhöyük was not static. Over the millennium of its occupation, the climate of central Anatolia shifted in ways that reshaped life on the Konya plain. When Çatalhöyük was first settled, conditions were relatively temperate and moist. This was an ideal place to settle, with abundant resources. Wetlands, seasonal lakes and marshes extended across the plain, supporting reeds, wild cattle, deer and waterfowl. These environments made hunting productive and diverse, and they supported early cereal cultivation along the river margins. Over time, however, paleoclimate records from lakes and sediments in the region indicate a gradual trend towards increasing aridity. Rainfall becomes less reliable. Wetlands began to shrink and fragment, and the landscape beyond the settlement slowly opened up into drier steppe. Researchers have sifted through an enormous amount of material and microscopically examined plant remains to reconstruct the vast array of plant resources utilised here. And from the first, these people were farmers. They grew cereals like wheat and barley, and pulses like pea, lentil, bitter vetch and grass pea. And they went out into the landscape and gathered wild resources like wild mustard, and nuts like acorn and almond and maybe pistachio, and fruit like the hackberry, which comes from the European nettle tree. Changes in farming practices over time reflect wider climatic changes. such as, from the Middle Period, barley being selected to be more drought tolerant. And human remains tell us about diet too. Experts have examined the teeth and bones of people and animals from Çatalhöyük, where certain chemical signals reveal information about the kinds of foods they ate, and also their mobility in the landscape. Studies of the various households have revealed that although they all harvested and processed cereals, pulses and meat, there were differences in farming and dietary choices between areas and households, which tells us something about social organisation within the settlement. It shows that each household was its own economic unit, farming its own plots, herding its own herds, preparing and cooking its own food. And across the site there also seems to be age and sex-related dietary differences too. And from the earliest phases of Çatalhöyük, animal resources were obtained by both hunting and herding. The tens of thousands of animal bones and bone fragments analysed by researchers provides a vast amount of evidence, not only about what animals were eaten, but also how and where they were kept in life, and how they were butchered and cooked afterwards. There's also a vast amount of coprolites which are teeming with evidence. These people hunted a range of animals in the landscape beyond the settlement, particularly aurochs, the wild cattle, and also various species of deer, mostly red but also fallow and roe deer, and wild boar, the wild ass, and foxes, badgers and even bears. They also took a range of birds like geese and duck from the wetlands and the great bustard from the steppes. Some of these species they likely hunted more for their horns, teeth, skins and feathers rather than their meat, although that surely didn't go to waste either. Sheep were the main domesticated species from the start, with goats present in smaller numbers. Having a few goats in the herd enabled more of the available plants to be browsed as well as grazed, and these animals were well suited to the mixed wetland steppe environment of the early Konya plain, and could be managed close to or even within the settlement. Although proximity of the herds to the settlement also changed over time, herding was flexible and household-based and provided a reliable source of meat, milk and hides. There was a dip in sheep consumption in the middle phase, but then a rise in sheep bones in the later phases where they focused even more on herding sheep, especially in the south area of the mound. You see a lot of changes in the society around the middle of the millennium, and their hunting practices also changed over time as the landscape became drier and perhaps wild resources became less predictable. For most of the millennium they focused on wild aurochs, but by the end they had started to raise domesticated cattle. Tending cattle obviously requires special skill and knowledge, and so this adoption suggests changes not just in the wider environment, but in social and labour organisation. They also had dogs at Çatalhöyük, not in huge numbers, but they probably roamed the settlement, especially the middens and open areas, probably scavenging and maybe catching pests and scoffing up rubbish, just like the standard village dog around the world today. The people also seem to have eaten dogs sometimes and occasionally used dog heads in rituals. Presumably they also used dogs for hunting and for managing herds, but of course these activities largely took place beyond the settlement. So what was the settlement actually like? The settlement was composed of mud brick houses, often densely packed together, although there were open areas too, and all the walls were constructed of mud brick. Despite what's often shown in reconstructions, generally every house had its own 4 walls. During the early era, there was more use of shared party walls between buildings, which suggests the earliest homes were built together in clusters. But over time, as some houses were demolished and others rebuilt, this practice disappeared, and each house had its own 4 walls. However, they were usually separated by just a few centimetres. This meant there was no room for streets or alleys to walk between them, and access to the buildings was made by ladders from the roof above. People moved around the settlement at roof level, which could have different heights, which were themselves traversed by a series of ladders. Probably plenty of daily activity took place on the roofs. But activities took place inside the buildings as well, despite the apparent poor light and ventilation, owing to the apparent absence of windows. There are almost no true right angles, and it seems like it grew as an organic cellular agglomeration of buildings over time, rather than a unified planned layout. Studies of the site also often refer to the north and south areas. This reflects the geography of the modern mound, as well as the excavations that have taken place. The mound consists of a large southern area 20 metres high, and a smaller northern peak of 9 metres high, and a lower eastern one 5 metres high. They're not separate mounds, as the valleys between the peaks also show signs of occupation, just like the higher areas, so it was one settlement. But perhaps the peaks are areas or neighbourhoods of more intense, repeated occupation and persistence. Mellart, in his 1960s excavations, focused on the larger south area and dug right down to the earliest layers. The modern excavations opened up the north area, as well as excavating the south area too. This society has been called egalitarian, and that's broadly true, in that there were no clear rulers or aristocracy, no obvious signs of slavery or an underclass and so on. But that doesn't mean everyone was exactly equal. For example, the southern area, a neighbourhood perhaps you could call it, seems to have had more of the more important houses in the settlement than did the north, while the north seems to have had more middens or open areas. You see these various reconstructions of the whole settlement or sections of it that show this giant, dense conglomeration, and there's a couple of things I want to say about these. First, it's the size of the settlement and the population living here at any one time. It's actually very hard to work out how many houses were occupied at the same time, and for much of the research project, population estimates ranged from 7,000 to 3,000, which would make it truly enormous for such an ancient settlement. But more recent work has concluded it was more like 600 to 800 people living at any one time, which is quite a different picture. Not everyone agrees with the lower numbers, by the way. I saw Ian Hodder saying he can't see how the population could have been below 1,000. Either way, that's a lot for the 7th millennium, at a density that would have required innovations in social organisation to make it work. The other thing I don't see discussed much is that there were actually open spaces between many of the houses. These spaces were called middens by the first researchers. Middens are understood as mounds of waste material, refuse deposits, and although that doesn't quite describe these open spaces, the terminology has been retained. The various clusters of houses seem to have shared open areas between them. We could think of them as something like courtyards. These open areas had many uses, and it's important, I think, to remember that they existed, and they were places that people used and lived in. They made and used tools in these areas. They probably chopped wood and did carpentry, stored resources, kept animals here in pens and stalls, maybe butchered and prepared animals, as well as using these areas to defecate and dispose of waste. Probably you can imagine children running around them, playing. And through all these many activities, refuse accumulated over time, providing an enormous amount of information about the settlement and the people who lived here. The middens weren't always in the same place either. Some abandoned houses were deliberately turned into middens, while later houses were sometimes built on top of spaces where middens had been before. Anyway, I think it's important to bear in mind that although the houses themselves are what we tend to focus on, these open spaces were also important, vital really, for the people who lived here. And in fact, middens at Çatalhöyük became larger, more persistent, and perhaps more socially important over the life of the settlement. In the late phases, the whole settlement sort of opens up more. This reflects changes in the social roles of houses over time too. But let's look inside these houses. What makes them so fascinating? The internal design of houses at Çatalhöyük was broadly consistent across the site. They usually consisted of a single large room, often roughly square, sometimes accompanied by one or more smaller side rooms. Wooden support posts were set into pits against the internal walls, and the roofs were constructed from oak and juniper beams, supporting layers of reeds and clay. These houses were the centre of daily life. They contained ovens and hearths for cooking, areas for art, ritual and burial, and spaces where people slept, ate and prepared food, and made tools. Side rooms were often used for storage and food preparation. brick and plaster platforms lined parts of the main room and were likely used for sleeping and working. A large clay oven with a smaller circular hearth nearby was typically positioned against the south wall, beneath the roof opening through which people entered the house. Storage bins, shallow basins, and small pits were also common. Although houses varied in size and detail, their internal space was always carefully constructed. The raised platforms were kept clean and frequently replastered, while areas around the ladder and hearth accumulated ash and debris. Archaeologists describe this as a division between clean and dirty floors. In many houses, the cleaner areas lay to the north and east, although this was a tendency rather than a strict rule. Walls, posts, niches, and built-in furniture were coated in white lime-based plaster, and it was these surfaces that were sometimes decorated with paintings or moulded reliefs. The walls were replastered repeatedly, sometimes seasonally, perhaps even once a month, as smoke from the hearth blackened the surfaces. Most houses were lived in for several decades, often around 80 years, before being deliberately demolished. Changes could occur during a house's life. New ovens or hearths might be added, storage bins altered, or basins removed. But eventually, the house reached the end of its use life. Typically, it was emptied of portable objects and carefully dismantled. Over 1,000 years, this repeated process created the Great Mound we see today. Some houses had short lives, but others were rebuilt many times, 4 or more times, meaning they could persist for centuries. And these longer-lived buildings also contained more burials and were more elaborate in their internal fittings and symbolic features. Some motifs were even repeated across successive rebuildings, and the researchers sometimes refer to these as history houses. This is something that I find particularly interesting because it gets to the heart of questions about Çatalhöyük's social organisation and the degree of inequality within it. It's often said that because there are no public buildings and no temples and no obvious elite burials, and because houses are broadly similar in size and form, this was an egalitarian society, but not all houses were the same. When James Mellart excavated in the 1960s, he noticed that some buildings had far more wall paintings and large numbers of bucrania, cattle skulls, horns, or clay representations embedded into walls and platforms. And it was these buildings that were rebuilt again and again to the same plan. Mellart interpreted them as shrines, and if shrines existed, one might expect priests and a priestly class. But from the 1990s onwards, Ian Hodder's team showed that these were not temples at all. They contained hearths, ovens, storage bins, domestic tools, and everyday refuse. They were lived-in houses. But they were still special. Perhaps only 5 to 10% of houses fell into this category, and more of them were in the south area than the north. Because of their persistence, history houses have been interpreted as repositories of memory, anchors of lineage, tradition and identity across generations. And perhaps the most powerful way they fulfilled this role was through burial, because a typical house might have 5 to 10 burials beneath its floors, while history houses could have 30 or 40, and one had over 60. And it's important to note that most people who lived and died at Çatalhöyük were not buried beneath house floors at all. Most bodies must have been exposed beyond the settlement, or disposed of in ways archaeology cannot easily detect. All floor burials were therefore already special, and the history houses were especially so. So what can all this tell us about these people and this society? Mortuary practice is one of the most complex and revealing aspects of Çatalhöyük. Burying some special people beneath the floors and platforms of houses while they were occupied was not unique to Çatalhöyük and appears in other Neolithic societies across the region. But the scale here is exceptional. Over 400 burials have been excavated here, and they show that burial followed certain patterns. Infants were often placed in hearth or oven areas, usually in the southern part of the house. Adults were typically buried beneath raised platforms in the northern areas. Newborns were sometimes placed beneath floors as foundation deposits, marking the beginning of a new phase of building or the construction of a house. Burial was therefore spatially structured and integrated into domestic architecture, and it shows an age-based social differentiation in this society. Bodies were not always left intact. Adult men and women were sometimes buried, and their graves were later reopened, with their skulls or limbs removed. In one case, a plastered male skull was found cradled in the arms of an adult female. Removed body parts may have circulated for some time before being deposited in specific contexts, such as beneath wall posts or in abandonment deposits. These practices suggest special relationships with certain dead individuals. Death did not necessarily mark the end of a person's social role. And before burial, bodies were sometimes subjected to complex treatments. This may have involved exposure, partial decomposition, or the use of heat, although practices varied and aren't fully understood. But these processes often destroyed DNA, making genetic analysis difficult. And because the child burials here have better DNA preservation, it suggests that infants and young children were not subjected to the same degree of post-mortem processing as adults. As in many traditional societies, this likely reflects differences in social status. Childhood often involved gradual incorporation into social personhood through rites of passage that had not yet occurred. It seems that, generally speaking, at Çatalhöyük, the older you were, the more social status you could have. Some have argued that the burial of infants beneath house foundations represent child sacrifice, because what are the chances they always had one or more babies' deaths coinciding with house construction? But it might be instead that babies who died naturally were sometimes kept, perhaps wrapped or placed in baskets, and later deposited when a new building phase began and a child deposition was required. The house, and the household it contained, was the foundational and organising social unit of the society, but they weren't just made up of nuclear and extended families. There was a superb ancient DNA paper published in 2025 that provided many incredible insights into this complex social structure. The researchers managed to sample 131 individuals buried in 35 houses, and the team combined the genetic evidence with the archaeological contexts to trace relationships between individuals. In the earliest generations, people buried in the same house often turned out to be close biological relatives, which suggests that houses functioned as extended family units, with blood relations anchoring social groups, which makes sense and is what you would expect. But as the centuries progressed, those patterns changed. In the later periods, burials in the same house frequently failed to show close genetic ties, even though isotopic evidence indicates they shared similar diets and life histories. This means they likely lived together when they were alive. They actually formed households in life, and it wasn't just bodies being swapped around in different houses. It implies that biological relatedness became less central to how people were grouped. They must have been doing things like fostering or adoption of children from different families. So socially defined membership of households became increasingly more important rather than descent alone. Presumably, this was done to help tie these different neighbourhoods and families together. Maybe they were finding it difficult to govern a society of natural families living close together, and so they implemented these practices to weaken the family unit and so strengthen the ties across the wider society. And what genetic links there were across generations in households tended to be through the female line. This is notably different from almost all other similar DNA studies done for societies in Neolithic and Bronze Age Europe, where descent was overwhelmingly through the male line. And this is notable because these societies of Neolithic Europe began with migration from Anatolia, and I'll come back to this later. Whereas here at Çatalhöyük, between 70% to 100% of the time, female offspring remained connected to buildings, whereas adult male offspring may have moved away. One might think that perhaps this makes sense in a society that linked women with the home, and that it doesn't mean necessarily that women had higher social status generally. However, female infants and children were more frequently buried with grave goods than their male counterparts, which does suggest a higher social value was attached to girls. So these patterns tell us it was a society in which female lineage and residence played a defining role, even as broader kinship structures became more entwined over its life. All this makes you wonder how decisions were made, whose voices carried weight, and how importance was recognised. From all the evidence, from diets to burials and DNA, it seems like older people had more social importance than younger people, and perhaps women had more importance than men. And maybe it's possible this is reflected in their art too. I've talked repeatedly about the changes seen here over time, as this society adapted to internal challenges, to climatic changes, and no doubt to wider social influences from across the region, and these changes are seen in their artworks too. Excavations at Çatalhöyük revealed a huge number of wall paintings, reliefs, and installations. Wild animals clearly had an important symbolic role at Çatalhöyük. Not just any wild animals, but fast or dangerous or flesh-eating wild animals and birds. Men are shown teasing, baiting, and dominating huge aurochs and other wild animals, as if reconstructing real or mythical scenes and stories. These animals surely embodied power and the unpredictable forces of the wild, concepts closely tied to hunting and to a world that was only partially under human control. And this is so fascinating to me because of the popular image of Çatalhöyük. One that I have related in this video is of this dense, dark warren of houses where grain farmers were ruled over by obese matriarchs. And maybe that's true. Yet there was also so much imagery of men out hunting in the wild, along with the symbolism of death and violence. You wonder if their conception of themselves, especially early on, was still essentially as hunters. And maybe their power structures were still based around these ways of life and heroic feats of resource acquisition. Or perhaps there were these opposing or complementary forces at work, the masculine hunters out in the plains and wetlands and distant uplands, and the feminine ruling the domestic world and processing the grain. And perhaps it's the case that over the centuries the latter began to be increasingly emphasised. They also made thousands of small figurines in clay and stone. The female figurines are world famous, but most figurines they made, by far, were of animals, in the form of cattle, boar, sheep, goats, bear and canids, as well as a great many horns by themselves. And they were made from the start, right through to the end of the site, although horns became increasingly popular. And leopards or felines appear linked with human figures in some of the more carefully made figurines of stone and fired clay. Most of the figurines were small, and they weren't made with a huge amount of care or skill, and were mostly discarded in middens, often perhaps not too long after being made, while others were surely made by skilled artists and could be deposited in more significant places, like in walls, in burials, or in grain bins. So they surely had a variety of functions in this society. But the most intriguing and most famous figurines are those depicting mature women with exaggerated breasts, bellies and buttocks, the 3 Bs they call them. These forms developed as agriculture and herding became more central to daily life, and when survival depended less on hunting prowess and more on fertility, continuity, and long-term care of people, animals, and land. What these figurines mean has been much debated. Mellart thought they were representations of a hypothetical mother goddess, part of a long tradition across the region. Actually, this video started out as a script about Neolithic female figurines, but it's got a bit out of control now. Anyway, the experts don't see these as representing goddesses anymore. Ian Hodder has suggested that the later stone figurines reflect an increasing focus on individuality in the final phases of the settlement, perhaps representing specific persons rather than abstract ideas. Other specialists strongly disagree, arguing that the figures are not portraits at all, but idealised bodies, representing social values rather than individuals. Either way, they clearly emphasise female maturity and bodily abundance. Surely, qualities associated with long-term survival, experience, and authority in this long-lived agricultural community. Surely they reflect the importance of elder women, matriarchs, whose influence came from their lineage and the success of their household, the abundance provided by the people who farmed, herded, and prepared and cooked the food in these homes. One thing that struck me was whether older women with such an abundance of flesh were even capable of climbing up the ladders and out of these houses after a while. Maybe these matriarchs, supported by their daughters and granddaughters, symbolised the household and the house to such an extent that they became synonymous with it, perhaps never leaving in later life and then ultimately being entombed within it. So power at Çatalhöyük was not expressed in great temples or public squares or vast burial mounds, but it was instead embodied, carried in people who in some cases themselves became monumental. But although the society continued to change over the millennium, it would ultimately come to an end. Already, by around 6500 BC, life at Çatalhöyük was beginning to change. The settlement might have reached its greatest size in the Middle Period. Hundreds or even thousands of people were living together in extreme density, but with their success came consequences. Environmental pressures increased, and grazing and cultivation perhaps strained the surrounding landscape, and maybe centuries of hunting pressures impacted wild populations. Climatic changes meant they had to adapt their economies, and at the same time, social practices were changing. Wall paintings became less elaborate and less frequent. Houses were rebuilt more quickly, with fewer symbolic installations carried forward from earlier phases. The intense focus on ancestral continuity, on rebuilding the same house over generations, burying the dead beneath its floors, began to weaken. Burials beneath house platforms declined sharply. All societies are faced with the opposing forces of tradition and innovation. Tradition is the collective wisdom of all your ancestors, customs and ideas passed on only because they were successful and correct. And yet, every generation faces new challenges. Sometimes these are technologies and ideas that our ancestors had never encountered, never even imagined. And so societies must also adapt themselves, and the ones that do so successfully will continue. But crucially, some societies can innovate so far that they lose continuity with their past. They develop into something unrecognisable and different to what came before. In a way, they adapt themselves into extinction. And perhaps what happened here was influenced by a dramatic climate episode. Around 6200 BC, a climatic event known as the 8.2 kiloyear event brought cooler, drier conditions to much of the northern hemisphere. On the Konya plain, wetlands shrank and rainfall became less reliable. At Çatalhöyük, this was about when herding intensified. Domestic cattle herding was introduced, and they herded and ate more sheep, especially in the south area. This was where the special houses with most of the decorations and burials had been. It seems to me that the south area and the people who lived there were more important than the people in the rest of the mound from the start right up until the end. You wonder what social changes happened as herding cattle began in the final period. No doubt this was a rational choice to secure resources that were becoming harder to obtain. But I can't help but wonder if, in the process of losing the social importance of the wild hunt, it also somewhat further domesticated the people too. Maybe this was one of the processes that eventually led to them changing beyond recognition and beyond memory and abandoning the mound. And technological practices also developed. Pottery styles changed, becoming more varied and refined, and tools became more standardized. Middens or open areas became more prominent, especially in the north area, and we know that people began to move. And a new settlement began next door, across the river, to a site archaeologists call the West Mound. The people who built the West Mound were the descendants of those who had lived on the east. And actually, there was overlap between the two occupations. But the two neighbouring societies weren't living in quite the same way. On the West Mound, houses were more widely spaced and were entered at ground level. The dense, inward-facing roofscape of the East Mound was left behind. Houses became more independent, more self-contained. They were larger, more complex, often with multiple rooms arranged around a central space, and hearths were placed centrally within rooms. And they no longer buried people beneath the house floors. The ancestors were no longer present inside the house along with the living. The house was still important, but it was no longer sacred, no longer a vessel for memory. Their artistic expression changed too. They didn't have wall paintings or reliefs like those of the East Mound, and the walls were no longer replastered again and again. Instead, artistic expression shifts to pottery, as painted vessels appear for the first time. Some of the motifs continue, but it seems like the way they were living had fundamentally changed, no doubt influenced by the wider world. Researchers think maybe the painted pottery reflects new practices related to public consumption, and maybe there were new opportunities for individual expression and group differentiation, and new ways to accumulate wealth and power. As new resources like copper began being used here and in Europe, new elites gradually emerged in the coming centuries and millennia, based on the control of these vital resources. Maybe the Neolithic people felt that their traditions no longer worked in this new world, and the authority of the ancestors had lost its power over them in the present, and so they physically moved away from them, abandoning them in turn. And by about 5900 BC, the Neolithic settlement was largely abandoned, along with many of its traditions and customs, and the people in the West Mound continued to live there until about 5600 BC. One imagines them in this new site in the west, looking across the river at the overgrown mud brick ruins of the settlement of their ancestors. I wonder what they thought of it and how they remembered them. Something I wonder about as I look at it is the people who chose to move there across the river to the west, and those who chose to move away entirely, even centuries before this final break. Ancient DNA and material culture evidence both suggest that small numbers of people moved into Çatalhöyük across the centuries. These would have been small groups, maybe just a household or two at a time, every now and then, arriving from surrounding areas, and they didn't fundamentally alter the character of the settlement. New ceramic styles appear at different times, hinting that newcomers often brought their own traditions with them. Yet Çatalhöyük absorbed these influences without losing its core identity. But movement from this region also went westwards, perhaps out of the settlement. Recent ancient DNA studies show that farming populations from central and eastern Anatolia moved westwards between about 7000 and 6000 BC, mixing with local hunter-gatherers in western Anatolia. From there, their descendants crossed the Aegean into Europe, carrying farming, animals, and new ways of life. They brought technology and culture from their ancestors, from agriculture to clay and stone figurines, especially female ones. But the societies of Neolithic Europe were organised quite differently from Çatalhöyük, particularly that the DNA evidence from burials across Neolithic Europe show stronger evidence for patrilineal descent in these societies, in contrast to the matrilocal and matrilineal practices at Çatalhöyük. I wonder if at least some people left Çatalhöyük and started new societies elsewhere because they wanted something different and chose to live in a different way. Perhaps some chose mobility and freedom over continuity, chose new lands over deep roots, and different social rules over old ones. If so, then descendants of people who made those choices may have helped shape the societies that spread across Europe. And these societies of Neolithic Europe continued this pattern of growth and colonisation for centuries until they reached almost every part of the continent. And if that's true, then perhaps the legacy of Çatalhöyük didn't end on the Konya Plain in 6000 BC. Thank you very much indeed to my patrons and channel members for supporting my work. If you enjoy what I do here, please join us using the links in the description below. Now, to find out more about the history of the Near East, please watch this video on the warfare of early Mesopotamia. Thank you very much for watching.